On the morning of May 30th, 1876, Dolmabahce Palace was surrounded by soldiers. 5 days later, the Sultan of that palace was found in a pool of blood. The official report summed it up in one word: suicide. But one of the doctors who signed that report left behind a far more cautious sentence, and 5 years later, this death would put an entire empire on trial. This is the story of the death of Sultan Abdulaziz. Suicide or murder? Let's see what the documents actually say. Just 20 days before the coup, a protest nobody expected erupted in Istanbul. Theology students known as softers gathered in the thousands outside the Sublime Porte, protesting economic collapse and a helpless government. On the 10th of May, 1876, more than 10,000 people are said to have joined. The pressure grew so great that Abdulaziz was forced to dismiss Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedim Pasha and the chief religious authority that very day. But this was not the end of the crisis, it was the beginning. The men who replaced them would shake the throne itself 3 weeks later. Mutersim Rustu Pasha became Grand Vizier. Hasan Hayrullah Effendi became Sheikh al-Islam. Hussein Avni Pasha took command of the army, and Midhat Pasha, a champion of constitutional government, took over the state's highest advisory council. 11 years earlier, a group of intellectuals known as the Young Ottomans had begun championing the idea of constitutional rule. Now that idea had reached the very top of the state. The road to the coup of May 30th was paved by this protest. Abdulaziz had come to the throne at 31 and became the first Ottoman sultan ever to travel to Western Europe. But in the final years of his reign, the treasury had sunk into debt, the economy had collapsed, and discontent was growing in the army and the bureaucracy. His reign had launched a great modernization drive, a navy built to rival the great powers of Europe, new schools, expanding railway and telegraph lines. The Sultan visited Western Europe as part of that vision. But the bill for these investments was crushing. The treasury survived on massive foreign loans. At the end of 1875, the state could no longer pay even the interest on its foreign debt, and formally defaulted. This financial collapse would become one of the strongest justifications for the coup that followed. On the morning of May 30th, 1876, War Minister Hussein Avni Pasha surrounded Dolmabahce Palace with troops. Beside him stood Grand Vizier Muhtachim Rustu Pasha and the constitutionalist statesman Midhat Pasha. The Sheikh al-Islam issued a fatwa accusing the Sultan of ruining the state and the treasury. That same morning, Abdulaziz was deposed, and his nephew Murad V was placed on the throne. The coup of May 30th did not happen in a vacuum. That same spring, a major crisis had erupted in the empire's Balkan provinces. The Bulgarian uprising that began in April 1876 was crushed with brutal force by Ottoman irregulars. The massacre at the town of Batak, with claims of thousands dead, echoed across the European press. The British statesman, William Gladstone, would soon publish his famous pamphlet, turning European public opinion against the Ottomans. Then, in June, Serbia and Montenegro declared war on the empire, demanding independence and territory. So, in the very week Abdulaziz was deposed and died, the empire was caught between financial collapse and the threat of losing its lands. The men behind the coup claimed they were saving not just a sultan, but a collapsing order. And it was no coincidence that the British embassy would assign one of its own doctors to examine Abdulaziz's body just days later. London was watching every development in Istanbul that turbulent summer. An empire was unraveling in its capital and on its borders at the same time. The deposed sultan was first taken to Topkapi Palace and placed in the old apartment of Selim III. According to tradition, he said, "They want to finish me here, just like my uncle." These words were not empty. Selim III had been deposed in a similar coup 70 years earlier and was killed inside the palace soon after. Abdulaziz, remembering this history, showed just how much he feared for his own future. The Ferrier Palace was a small annex on the Bosphorus shore, right next to Siragan Palace. The request to move there came from Abdulaziz himself. Perhaps he wanted to escape the historical weight of Topkapi. But 5 days later, exactly what he feared would come to pass. On the morning of June 4th, 1876, Abdulaziz asked to trim his beard. He was sent his mother Pertevni al-Sultan's embroidery scissors and a hand mirror. A short while later, it was noticed that no sound was coming from behind his door. When the door was forced open, the Sultan was found in a pool of blood. The veins of both his arms had been cut. One of the first to reach the scene was the coup's leading figure, Sultan Avni Pasha. He silenced the household and ordered the body moved to the coffee room of the guard station next to the palace. There, the body was laid on a straw mat, behind a curtain. A committee of 19 doctors was assembled to examine the body. It included both Ottoman physicians and doctors from foreign embassies. The committee's report declared the cause of death to be blood loss and concluded it pointed to suicide. But the report's key sentence was far more cautious. The doctors merely noted that the scissors shown to them could have produced these wounds, not a definitive finding a possibility, and a full autopsy was never performed. The doctors were essentially shown only the arms. For the next 150 years, many historians refused to trust that report. The most repeated objection was this: cutting one wrist to a lethal depth leaves that hand nearly useless. Cutting the second wrist to the same depth with a weakened hand is physiologically extremely difficult. Beyond that, Sultan Avni Pasha's immediate takeover of the scene, his blocking of a full medical examination, and the delay in help all deepened suspicion. Some accounts even claimed his beard had been torn, a tooth broken, a bruise left on his chest, even that wrestlers had attacked him. But these claims directly contradict the official record of one of the signing doctors, who wrote that the skin was pale and bore no bruise or mark whatsoever. That is why these details must be remembered as disputed claims, not established facts. In 2007, the blood-stained clothes kept in the storerooms of Topkapi Palace were re-examined. No tear or cut was found on the trousers, jacket, or shirt. Some experts read this as evidence against suicide, but the finding was never published in a peer-reviewed study, and some critics argue intact clothing is also consistent with suicide. So this too is not proof, just another layer in the debate. On the evening of June 15, 1876, while a cabinet meeting was underway at Midhat Pasha's mansion, an officer named Cherkes Hasan burst in with 2 pistols and a dagger. Hasan was the brother of Neshadil, one of Abdulaziz's favorites, who had died just days after the Sultan. That night he shot dead Sultan Avni Pasha and Foreign Minister Rashid Pasha and stabbed another Pasha. 2 days later, he was hanged in Bayezid Square. But the event made one thing very clear. Only 11 days after the Sultan's death, there were people even inside the army who believed this was murder. Murad V, who replaced Abdulaziz, lasted only 93 days on the throne. Immediately after his uncle's death, he suffered a severe nervous breakdown. The Cherkes Hasan raid 16 days later deepened the collapse. The new Sultan had witnessed men being killed before his eyes, inside the palace. On the 31st of August 1876, the palace doctors ruled that he was mentally unfit and he was deposed by fatwa. His brother Abdulhamid II took the throne. Murad V spent the rest of his life under house arrest in Siragan Palace on the Bosphorus, 28 years, and died there in 1904. One curious detail: according to some sources, about 9 months after leaving the palace and its pressures, his condition visibly improved. Which keeps a question alive to this day: how much of the insanity ruling was genuine medicine and how much was political convenience? In the summer of 1881, in a tent erected in the gardens of Yildiz Palace, the leading figures of the coup were put on trial, accused of Abdulaziz's murder. Among the defendants was Midhat Pasha himself. The trial opened in that tent on June 27th and with astonishing speed ended just 2 days later. On June 29th, it was presided over by Ali Sururi Effendi. The key witness was a woman named Pervin Felek Hanim, whose denunciation had launched the case. The confession of a defendant, the wrestler Mustafa, was also central, but most historians believe both the testimony and the confession may have been extracted under pressure and staged in advance. Even the 19 doctors' report of 1876 had failed to establish a definitive method of killing. The court could not resolve that uncertainty either. The court found the defendants guilty, including Midhat Pasha, and sentenced them to death. The new Sultan, Abdulhamid II, commuted the sentences to life exile in Taif. Midhat Pasha died in that Arabian exile. According to many sources, he was strangled. But one crucial caveat cannot be skipped. Most historians do not see this as an impartial trial. The prevailing view is that it was a show trial, engineered by Abdulhamid to erase his most powerful political rival, the constitutionalist Midhat Pasha. which means this court's verdict cannot be accepted as definitive proof of murder. 1876 was a year without precedent in Ottoman history. 3 different sultans took the throne within a single year. Abdulaziz was deposed and died within days. His successor, Murad V, was removed after 93 days on grounds of insanity. And the third, Abdulhamid II, took the throne. In December of that same year, Abdulhamid proclaimed the new constitution and convened the first Ottoman parliament. But just over a year later, citing the war with Russia, he shut the parliament down and began a personal rule that would last 30 years. Constitutional government would only return with the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. In other words, the chain of death, arrest, and abdication compressed into a single summer went on to shape the empire's next 30 years. So, what really happened? The honest answer: nobody knows for certain. The documents we have prove 2 things. The official investigation was deliberately left incomplete, and the trial, 5 years later, was a political reckoning. But those documents do not prove who was responsible. Historians remain divided to this day. Some defend the suicide thesis, others murder. Perhaps this uncertainty is not a flaw in the story, it is the story. Proof that even at the very top of an empire, the truth could be buried this easily. And remember, this was not just the death of one sultan. In the same year, a second sultan was deposed for insanity, and a third opened a 30-year era of absolute rule. The fate of an empire changed hands 3 times in a matter of months. What do you think? Let's talk in the comments.